Order. I would like to start the first session of the International Development Select Committee on the FCDO's approach to value for money. This is something that the committee is very interested in, and I'm sure the public are very interested in as well. We've got two panels today. Could I ask Stefan and Shamik if you could introduce yourselves and sort of why you're a witness in front of us, what experience you're bringing. Stefan, could I start with you, please?
Stefan Dercon. I'm currently a professor of economic policy at the Development School of Government at Oxford University. I was the chief economist of DFID between late 2011 and 2017, and I continued as an advisor to ministers and then all the way on and off until the merger and Dominic Raab.
Thank you. Shamik?
I'm Shamik Dhar. I was chief economist at the then FCO between 2014 and 2018. I left the FCO in 2018 to become global chief economist at Bank of New York Mellon. I retired last June, but I've also had sort of 40 years experience, roughly half in the public sector, half in the private sector, so hopefully that brings something.
Living the dream, is retirement lovely?
No comment. Yes, it is wonderful. It is wonderful.
If I ask you, Shamik, could you tell us how you would define the term value for money in the context we're doing this inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's first and foremost really important to have a clear objective in mind, and then value for money to me is delivering that objective at the lowest possible cost, for the best use of public money, if you like. And that involves fairly careful analysis and measurement. But yes, ultimately it's about minimising the cost of inputs to get the output that you want.
Thank you. And Stefan, would you agree with that, or would you add something to it?
No, it is very similar. And the important thing that Shamik already alludes to is the importance of defining clearly the value, and then it becomes essentially what technically we would usually call cost effectiveness. Basically trying to deliver that objective at the lowest cost possible.
And to both of you, but Stefan, if I could start with you, the definition that you've given, did that change in your time as the chief economist?
So I dug out DFID's approach to value for money document of July 2011. I think that's still relevant. There's not that much controversial about it, but the definition of value changed over time.
In what way?
So if you have a very straightforwardly simple objective, as by 2011 we were clearly still doing a narrow focus on poverty reduction, you have a very well-defined single objective and you judge everything against that. Of course, it is multidimensional, so it could be in education or in health, somewhat similarly defined, but it was a particular type of outcome. I think from about 2015, with the budget and the Treasury's development paper, we suddenly had multiple objectives, and we got into a world where occasionally secondary objectives seem to be more important than primary.
And Shamik, same question to you, and you had the period sort of in the run-up and during, run-up and during Brexit, I think.
Yes. So it didn't really change for me. I'd arrived in 2014. 2015, as Stefan said, was when really the Foreign Office got its first slug of ODA-related prosperity fund-related money. So it didn't change as such, but certainly at a higher level of management, the secondary objectives that Stefan is talking about became sort of a topic of frequent discussion. What is it exactly we're trying to achieve here?
Could you put a little bit more meat on what a secondary objective is? Yeah,
so clearly, what I would say is throughout, and because the Foreign Office hadn't been a big spending department beforehand, when we got the 1 billion plus worth of Prosperity Fund money in 2015, we were very, very cautious. We followed essentially DFID's approach to measuring and assessing value for money, and of course followed the recommendations of the Act in all situations. But what I would say is that there was an active discussion, if you like, at the top of the Foreign Office about whether, if you like, UK foreign policy interests should or could become a part of the assessment process. And certainly Stefan and I had fairly frequent discussions about that. Can I just stress that at all times, though, during my period, the primary focus and the overarching focus was poverty reduction as defined by DFID.
I was in the chamber when the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson came in and referred to ODA as the cash point in the sky. You'd left at that point, I believe. What did you think when he said that?
I understood why he said it, and certainly when he was Foreign Secretary, we had discussions along those sorts of lines. I think it was. I understood why he said it because it seemed sometimes as if this was, kind of money being distributed from almost from nowhere. However, I don't think he focused necessarily on the detail of how that process was being conducted. And actually, what I would stress is that while I was there, it was a very, very exhaustive process at the micro level. And as I said, importing most of the advice that Stefan's department had disseminated by then.
And money from nowhere, I would say it was taxpayers' money going to support the poorest people in the world. What are your thoughts?
Well, that particular example, I was by then back in FCDO just after the merger, definitely baffled me because it was alluding to actually the Benazir Bhutto income support program in Pakistan, probably one of the very few effective development programs we were doing in Pakistan. This is cash transfer programs. We know from all the evidence that we actually can have certainty what the impacts of cash transfer programs are. These are very direct support to the poorest people, well targeted. It was a very poor example to pick, but of course very deliberately picked.
I've got Monica, then David Reid.
Can I ask what you said on this muddying of secondary and primary objectives, how that filtered through to the culture of the organisation, therefore managers that were looking at value for money programmes and how they measured them?
So let me stress again, I think in day-to-day practice, in day-to-day assessment, it had very little impact because we were essentially following the rules as was set down by very clearly on the use of ODA money, and we were very cautious and made sure that we weren't exposing ourselves, if you like, to that sort of to any kind of criticism from that side. What I meant was, I think at the time there was a sort of big policy discussion going on amongst ministers and senior officials as to what the purpose of ODA ultimately might be. It is ultimately, as defined in the Development Act, about poverty reduction, but could there be secondary benefits that we could pursue while not watering down the primary focus that might have benefits or work in the UK national interest more broadly.
So could I add?
David Reid. Oh, sorry.
If I may. So in some sense it refers to the kind of changing how do we define value. Okay. So it's important that a value for money definition, as it is used and in all the documents also used, is a form of most effectively delivering on a particular objective. Now, it doesn't mean that it is the highest return for poverty reduction. You're not going to pick necessarily the program in Pakistan, say, that has the highest return from the point of view of poverty reduction. But once you settle on something, you say, okay, that seems to be consistent with definitions. Primary and secondary seem to be aligned. Can we now make sure that we deliver it as efficiently, as effectively as possible? And so that's the kind of the boundary. The value itself, what you're actually going to do, was much more liable to intense debate, and we should spend more or in that kind of country, on that kind of program. And that's not necessarily choosing to start with the one that has the highest return to poverty reduction in a country. But it is a switching of the value part, and how you define what is it that you're going to pursue is important. I've no doubt that in terms of the value for money, also our colleagues at FCO at the time were very careful. In fact, definitely there were lots of ex-DFID or DFID people seconded also supporting that process. But the issue is much more about what you were spending it on, not whether you were spending it in a value for money way once you decided that objective.
Useful, thank you.
David Reid.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for both being here. Shamik, so just going back to that point about those conversations happening when the merger happened, I would expect by now that foreign policy should be part of the assessment for any development work that's going out. So would it be possible to talk through how those conversations went, who the dominant voices within that, were they coming from the development side or from the FCO side, and where do you think that conversation is now, and do you think foreign policy is being included in the assessment process?
Yeah, I should stress I wasn't there when the merger actually took place, but certainly the conversation developed during my time there. I think initially 2014-15, the Foreign Office was crumbs. We've got a large slug of money here. We better manage it properly, and therefore let's use best practice. And best practice at the time was exactly what DFID were doing. And we strayed from that very, very little. I think what I was describing was a discussion that was going on amongst ministers, several foreign secretaries, but also junior ministers and senior officials, senior management at the top of the Foreign Office, who felt that perhaps there was a role for these, quotes, secondary objectives. I would put it slightly, I think Stefan's outlined it perfectly. The way I would describe it is that you have a primary objective that you're trying to maximise for the minimum amount of cost, but you maybe have some constraints, and those constraints kind of changed over time. That the discussion at the top was, could we not loosen the very strict definition of poverty reduction that was apparent in 2014-15. Now, during my time there, I have to say that didn't really happen in any kind of material way. However, the discussions were going on. I think now, since then, you're absolutely right. Clearly, the nature of development assistance has changed, and foreign policy considerations, I think, do play a bigger part than they used to.
In a formal way?
In a formal way, I suspect. I can't speak for those who are there now, but my suspicion is that they do enter.
So just to add one very small point.
Sam in, how small?
Very small. So just on that side, but this is an area that I really want to dig into. We had the Minister in front of us recently and also the Permanent Secretary. I've asked the same questions. I still don't think that conversation has firmed up in any meaningful way.
That's not wholly surprising, because foreign policy objectives tend to be, they tend to change over time, and they can be quite difficult to pin down, and particularly as geopolitical circumstances change. However, the way I would put it is that I think a foreign policy objective maybe operates as a more important input, a more important constraint than it did back in 2014-15 when I started.
Yeah, I mean, you slightly answered actually what I was going to ask, which it sounds to me that what you're saying is that value for money isn't defined in terms of poverty reduction. Obviously, the International Development Act says that the purpose of international aid is poverty reduction. So if not poverty reduction, then what goals and what do you feel was defining the goals of international aid?
So there's, to decide what the portfolio of resources of DFID to be spent on, there's multiple layers that one ends up going through. So you choose a country. The objective function that is being maximized is not how do I reduce global poverty in the most effective way. There's a set of...
It's not.
It's not. Because you actually begin to say there's probably about 30, 40 countries where we're going to take specific interest in. And, not for nothing...
Within that
No, that's exactly. So you'll get a later. Now, within a country, you will get certain choices. You will get certain choices, again, made of we want to focus on education, and that's not necessarily starting from the principle of that is the main constraint on poverty in that particular place. But there's a lot of good things you can do in reducing education. And so there is a particular level that I will have no doubt that in this entire period, all the way, in fact, up to the merger, that there was a very careful consideration of, once we more or less settled on the kind of thing we wanted to do, let's do it as effectively as possible with maximum impact on poverty reduction. But it could involve choices, for example, in this period, that people said, well, we should focus more, say, on private sector. And so you had a whole series of programs, including of Prosperity Fund that FCDO said, we're going to focus on working with UK private sector if we can. So these are constraints you put in.
You say people might suggest. Do you mean ministers might suggest?
Ministers may suggest, civil servants may suggest, yes. And indeed, it is in the liberty. And so, look, there's nothing unique about it anywhere in the world that this would happen. So in that sense, that becomes linked to foreign policy objectives. Value for money is actually, in the end, something much more confined to, once you've set it on what value you're going to pursue, are you going to do it in the most effective way? That's what all the guidance always said. It's not about go around the world looking for the best way of reducing poverty anywhere in the world.
Presumably there is some sort of theory of change that says that if we invest in education or if we invest in the private sector...
I'm not going to doubt that, and of course it's not an exact science to say so, but there is a reasonable argument to make that private sector development will be a really good engine of change in a country, or that education is a reasonable engine of change in a country. Our budgets relative to the size of these countries are still small, so we end up picking bits and pieces where we feel like, let us stand for this. And over time, ministers may have switched from maybe more focus on girls' education or on health towards more private sector. I think it's reasonable, but that's not the same as saying that.
Gentlemen, you're too interesting for this committee. I've got a very tiny supplementary from Brian, and then I'm going to start pushing you through the questions that we've got, if that's okay.
Well, mine was looking at one particular area which has seen a massive drop over the last few years, and that is actually WASH. And where you look at again, it comes down to the value of what you're doing, because of course, if you can provide water in a short distance, you can save massive amounts of time for people. You could also do other things with agriculture. So there are lots of different add-on benefits which can actually be hugely valuable.
So if the question here is that, of course, again, DFID or now FCDO, they're not alone in the world of development. WASH is a particular sector that you could argue involves a lot of infrastructure development. With our grant money instruments as the only instrument that we have to actually achieve poverty reduction, grants are not the best way necessarily to build infrastructure. Long-term loans and so on is maybe better. So there is a reasonable argument to make that if your budgets are confined, that you argue that maybe, for example, the World Bank should do more of that. And it's there. So it's again not, we're just one player in a bigger system. But I take your point, choices end up being made. Every time we say we'll spend more on education, we end up spending less on something else. It's by the nature of the way we allocate these budgets.
Can I say, committee, if we do have votes, then we'll pause the session and then come back for the second panel after that. So Noah.
Thank you, and this is to Stefan. Thank you for giving us this, I think, very rich picture of how one might stray from this objective function that you mentioned at the start, maximising the impact of every pound spent. You've outlined in this the DFID's original framework is how you get there, but can you just give us a bit more of a summary of how you really, this is very thorough, can you neatly summarise for us how you ensure the maximisation of every pound spent?
Right. In a way you ask me to tell you a little bit about the actual process and how it in practice is done. So the theory is definitely outlined in that document. One of the things that we got to by having this kind of framework, it created, first of all, a much more push inside the organization to be more evidence-based. If you're going to choose to try to be most effective as possible, well, you better check, how effective evaluations, researchers told us that certain ways could be. So it led very much to a kind of a more respect for evidence. It led to an expansion also of the Research and Evidence Division that would gather research around how impactful, how we should better redesign programs. If we're interested in WASH, how should we do it? What are the interventions that worked and not? So it gave us a bit of that part. And it became part of the culture as in the first instance to actually being a bit more careful and to be a bit more critical in terms of saying, yes, there's lots of things if a minister dreams up, let's do a girls' education program, that we have a better sense of which one should we do and which ones we shouldn't do amongst these, how we should do that. Related thing is the business case process became much more seriously taken seriously by all people. That meant people had to, whenever they proposed a program, to justify that it was consistent with the evidence, that the problem identification was correct, that the intervention had indeed the best return for that particular objective, the best way of doing that particular objective. It led to a lot of work around procurement and better designing how we dealt and so on. So it's a whole series of process that I definitely witnessed in the 6-7 years that I was there. There was definitely a lot of improvement in the actual process. But if you think of it, it led to a culture where people really paid attention before they approved the program. Do we think it will have an impact? And if I even today, in fact last week, get an invitation from Norway, can you come and please talk about value for money and how DFID did it, is that we were 10, 15 years ahead of lots of other governments that actually were trying doing it. So this is something, quote unquote, that gets exported even today in other organizations.
That's really interesting to hear, given the complexity that you just a moment ago outlined and how you might end up perhaps straying from some of these more clinical perhaps objectives. But I mean, and you sort of answered my next question around how things evolved over time, but the difference as I see it today is that today you've got a huge amount of data versus when this value for money approach was outlined, and you've had a huge leap forward perhaps in the sophistication of the approaches of impact measurement and management as you just described. I mean, would you say that the FCDO became more supportive of a more sort of impact accounting or even a more econometric approach?
So my sense is, with all the things that I described, that's a lot of process before you approve something. Although critically, the process tends to start when you more or less, as I was alluding to earlier, decided we're going to spend on that kind of thing in that kind of location. Okay? So that process. So the first thing is a little bit, if we worry about straying, it's that we have so many different objectives now, and that may be worth exploring. Will programs now being decided more because they serve UK growth, given that is the main objective of the government, or something else? But that's again on what value are you going to pursue. The second thing that I want to add to it, the weakness of all these things is that we are implementing all these programs in very complicated settings with very few people on the ground. And these days we would say this needs to be more complemented with a much more thorough understanding of how implementation happens, how can you fine-tune, how the feedback loops in doing it. Similar things that with any public expenditure in any place, that actually it's not so much the design, it has to be perfect, but then you have to be able to follow up and monitor and do the things. And that's probably where we also are there's still a lot of work to be done.
And if I may, would you say, at least when you were there, but still today, you saw that actually the value for money assessment was very much, in a way, secondary to those allocative decisions that had already been made?
No, when I was there, it was, I was there all the way. I was, of course, also for a year and a half after the merger. But if I talk on the DFID time, no, it was extremely taken seriously. There were some allocative decisions and so on. But
central to
that. But it slipped gradually, and then by the time of the merger, definitely within the whole, call it chaos of the merger, definitely a lot of these things were lost.
Really interesting to hear that shift. But lastly, how effective do you think DFID was at monitoring, just the monitoring process behind that?
So one of the big challenges we always had is that for the amounts of money spent, this was relatively few people on the ground. For example, GIZ, I was told, had 18,000 people. The German delivery agency had 18,000 people. We never had more than 3,500 people, including central government. The result is that we always had to do very large programs, which then had to be getting, for example, management agents, including sometimes the Big Four and things like that, PwC, KPMG, running big development programs without development expertise, who then subcontract further and subcontract further. So the scale of the programs was actually really high, and that created definitely challenges for monitoring, and especially to adjust when circumstances change. And so that, I would say, was probably had a bigger implication for the actual value for money than anything to do with the design. The design was definitely state of the art.
And you were able to monitor that, the development of these overheads, whether internal or external?
You mean when we had to outsource these things and so on? No, I think that is probably where it was done as carefully as we could, but that's extremely hard to do so, and there's definitely room for improvement. Okay, so that we need to find better ways of delivering, but that's not a problem that DFID encountered. It's a standard one. But it maybe the main thing to clock is that the value for money approach here described is very much ex ante, and then there is the reality of delivery. So you need to keep on having really good people. If I may then say, this is something I'm concerned with, that after the merger, those people who were experts in delivery on the ground, the capability in the development part of FCDO, definitely got dramatically weakened. And we had more and more people in the merged system that made decisions of monitoring money, allocating money, that are maybe excellent diplomats but never were trained in monitoring and evaluating money. So I would say that's one of the areas that I would suggest is worth looking into. It is at the moment this whole delivery chain still able to get a sense of real value for money, or what needs to be done to improve that? Because there's so many people in the delivery chain that are that arguably are not trained or don't have experience in handling these relatively vast sums of money.
Thank you. Brian.
A quick one, but with the sort of move to giving cash to individuals as a way of giving aid, possibly with cards, theoretically that would be a way in which you could really monitor right down to a micro level, where that money's been spent, and could provide a huge amount of data in terms of what people are spending that money on, and whether that's going into just immediate needs of buying a loaf of bread, or whether it's going into clubbing together to make sure a pump is repaired or whatever. Has there been any thought about that sort of going forward?
So, I shouldn't do this, but I almost put it back as another question. Is this how we monitor UK spending in Sheffield from here? I'm not sure we do. We're now doing this in outside countries, often in conflict, often with very fragile governments, where we have to do. It's not straightforward to do this. So there's a lot of attempts to using data and so on to do this better. But we're still a little bit away from where you are. So it is work in progress, but I would say it involves all public expenditure of governments, whether it's in the UK or overseas, that we could do better with in that respect.
Yeah.
Your supplementary?
Yep, no, that's good.
Okay. So how did DFID adapt its policies for humanitarian responses to maintain, or could it maintain, value for money?
So, well, I used to say inside DFID, the humanitarian sector is an evidence-free zone. Humanitarian organizations are not the most transparent in allowing people to do the research, to do the evaluation, to actually get the data in terms of what actually works, what doesn't work. Humanitarian principles seem to be always averse to actually, we better get to know what's happening. So there is an issue, was an issue of data. In fact, one of the things that DFID did very effectively, we actually started investing in research on humanitarian sector. And in fact, if you now these days have, in my side of profession in Economist, but also other areas, health research, there's so much now going on in the humanitarian sector. And for example, one way of adapting is that the bits of evidence we started gathering that in an awful lot of settings, food aid is far less effective than cash transfers. This was one of the things that DFID at the time pushed through, convinced other organizations in doing it. So we then actively took the lead, I think, on trying to actually bring evidence into the picture. And so that's a form of adaptation. If you don't have the evidence, it's very hard to do it really carefully, but then at least let's invest in that evidence. So the whole cash movement, where we wanted to make sure less based on food data, much more on cash, it's entirely come from that period. And you could say it was driven by, we know it has higher return for the same amount of money.
Thank you. Shamik, I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on, we're thinking about return on investment. So if you've been investing in a scheme for a number of years and then you withdraw the funding quickly, before we had examples of training projects for women and in the final year when they were going to do the evaluation and get the qualification, the funding was withdrawn. Is that taken into consideration when decisions around value for money are made?
Generally speaking, yes, though it probably could be done better. I mean, there are Green Book diktats, if you like, that suggest that you need to plan for the life of the commitment, but also you need to plan for transition as well. What happens at the end of the supposed lifetime of the project, and assess some of the costs involved with either withdrawing money very quickly or rotating it into something else. Now, I would say that, and we always paid attention to those costs, but I would say that they probably were more uncertain and more difficult to assess than the standard, kind of what bang per pound are you getting for doing this kind of work instead.
Let me pause you there, just to say to committee, the Minister is on her feet. We potentially have 2 votes, so can I ask both the witnesses but also committee members, can we bang through these? And if we can't get to stuff, if we could write to both of you, because we're really appreciating the answers that you're giving us. James?
I guess I just wanted to look at kind of the distinction between DFID and the FCO and their relative levels of performance. So I think we're all here saying and listening to the fact that you would say DFID was a top performer. The FCO, by comparison, was rated one of the least transparent spenders on foreign aid, 38th out of 47, as late as 2020. Can you just explain to me why the two are so different? And then we've merged them, and I think we've gone backwards rather than, to be honest, kept the DFID standard. So why was that? What was different that was happening in the FCO versus DFID?
I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the FCO was a lot smaller. The FCO's budget at my time was about, about 1.5, something like that. And your DFID's was about 15, something like that. DFID was about 10 times bigger, had more resources being thrown at it. Also,
that's easier, therefore, to demonstrate value for money with a smaller budget.
I would say it's when you're thrown a large slug of money, which is broadly speaking the equivalent of your existing budget. You inherit, if you like, a workforce that isn't necessarily best placed to deal with that money. And I think there was a learning process. My unit, I think, performed, I would say this, but I think my unit performed very, very well, not just in assessment, but in education. And one of the things I draw is that we need to make sure that there are economists throughout the FCO in order to make sure that this stuff happens properly going forward.
Gentlemen, I'm really, really sorry about this. I think you can see how engaged we were with the evidence that you were giving. So if we could follow this up in writing, we'd be incredibly grateful. Committee, I think there might be 2 votes. If we could come straight back, and then we'll start the second session then. Order, this session is now paused, suspended. We are restarting the International Development Select Committee session on the FCDO's approach to value for money. We're now going to turn to our second panel. We've got Dianne Stewart in the room, we've got Jennifer Armitage and Abdou, who is virtual. Could I ask, Abdou, could you introduce yourself and the organisation you're representing, please?
Sure, good afternoon. So my name is Abdoulaye Fabregas. I work at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate in a unit that looks at the big picture of development finance. And a big part of my work is actually looking at multilateral development cooperation, where we look both at inflows to the multilateral development system, so how donors fund multilateral organizations on development issues, and then also the outflows, so how these organizations use the resources that are entrusted to them.
Thank you. And how do you and your organisation define value for money?
So we don't have a specific definition in our directorate for value for money in development cooperation. I would say that we're often tempted to adopt a narrow quantitative definition, which would be making the most of limited resources. So looking both at the cost and benefits of a development intervention, and how much is invested in the ground compared to how much a donor has contributed. But we try more and more to look more at the qualitative considerations and see, whether a development intervention also responds to the needs or the issue that they're trying to solve. Things like, how is it targeted? Is it targeted where it's susceptible to achieve the most transformative impact in terms of country focus or sector focus? Is an intervention sustainable? So are you also building capacity at the same time so that you don't have to redo the same intervention at a later stage, and also at the timeliness of the intervention?
Thank you. Jennifer, could you introduce yourself and your organisation, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Armitage. I'm an applied health and social economist, and I'm currently based in Nairobi. Over the last 20 years, I've worked as a consultant with FCDO, the UN, and before that, the NHS and the Home Office in England to improve efficiency and effectiveness of public services. I'm currently director of LAMP Development, an Edinburgh-based organisation, not-for-profit. We combine analysis and practical advice. Our vision is that everyone has confidence that aid money is spent wisely and not wasted. So I set up LAMP over 10 years ago. I was living and working in Nigeria. Since then, LAMP's largely global South-based teams have led value for money reviews over 20 UK aid-funded programs, 15 countries, combined value of 1.2 billion. We're currently supporting health and education programs to implement value for money approaches across 11 countries in Africa and Asia. Outside of LAMP, I've held a number of positions relevant to this inquiry. I was a consultant on UNICEF WASH education programs in Nigeria, with the evaluation and learning component of a health program in Sierra Leone. And I was a technical expert on ICAI's performance review of DFID's approach to VFM in 2018.
Thank you. Can I ask, does your definition of value for money differ from the FCDO's, or is it the same?
I can answer that question sort of by making about sort of 5 reflections. I'm not sure whether you want that longer answer.
Appreciate
but
it.
I can go, and you can tell me if you need to move on. So if I may start by saying I've seen firsthand the positive impact that the FCDO framework has had on improving the use of ODA at country and programme level. And given the shifts globally in ODA at the moment, we welcome this review of the framework. It's served as an important defence of UK aid and demonstrated UK leadership in assuring that taxpayers and citizens of countries that receive ODA is being well spent and not wasted. So it has been useful. We do share the definition of making best use of resources to improve people's lives. And whilst we also align with the primary aim of poverty reduction, in practice, there are multiple objectives, multiple priorities which guide decisions. And they're now more explicitly outlined in FCDO's outcome delivery plan, such as tackling global challenges, responding to humanitarian crises, and supporting sustainable development goals, and others, as I'm sure you have been discussing. So what I want to just say is that given these multiple aims, a simple calculation of return on investment using traditional economic approaches will fall short. And that's why we think the FCDO framework is so important. And I can go on to give some examples of how we've used the framework in practice on programs, but I'm happy to do that as you want to.
Hello, Jennifer. I wonder if you could actually answer the question that I asked, which is, do you use the same value for money framework that the FCDO does, or does yours different, and if so, how?
So we have supported programs implementing FCDO programs, funded programs, and we support them to apply the FCDO framework in practice. So we work with them to come up with their own definitions, but we use the 4 E's or the 5 E's. We use the principles of value for money. We run training on the framework with the programs to really build an understanding of that framework in practice. So we're all about how do you apply that framework in practice. So yes is the short answer, but it's also adapted for the specific context and for the specific program.
Great, thank you. We have also received your written evidence, so anything that you can give us in this session that's above and beyond that would be appreciated. Thank you. Dianne, could I turn to you? Could you introduce yourself and tell us what value for money means for your organisation?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for having us this afternoon. So I am the Deputy Director of External Relations at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. I currently serve also as the Head of Donor Relations, and I run our replenishment process. I've been previously at the Global Fund since 2002. I was there seconded from my role at UNHCR to help set up the organisation. I ended up staying until 2009. I then went as Vice President to the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, where I worked for several years, and then was External Relations Director at UNFPA, working on women's health issues, and helped to set up the Global Financing Facility at the World Bank. And then in 2017, I went back to the Global Fund, was delighted to take up this role. The Global Fund, you may be aware, is the world's largest provider of grants for health programs in low and middle income countries. We operate in over 120 countries, primarily funding programs for AIDS, TB, and malaria, and for health systems. And I think it's important to understand our scale when we talk about value for money in the context of the Global Fund.
Can I ask you to focus on value for money, because we are quite pushed on time?
Sure. So the value for money framework that we use is very much associated with the differed value for money. We use the same efficiency, economy, equity, effectiveness framework that was referred to earlier that DFID had adopted in 2011. But I think there are some elements that are unique to the Global Fund that I can point to that describe particular value for money. One of the things the Global Fund focuses on is how effectively do we reduce the burden of AIDS, TB, and malaria on the countries in order to generate both efficiency and effectiveness in the health system itself for those countries, but also return on investment in an economic way. And the way in which we do this is ensure absolute effectiveness of the development assistance financing. There are a number of ways we do this, and I think I'll focus primarily on our methodology as opposed to our model. I'm happy to answer questions on the model. Firstly, we have allocative efficiency. So we're in 120 countries. How do we make sure that the way in which we allocate the over $5 billion that we spend every year most effectively to the countries that use that money? So we look at the burden of disease, we look at their ability to pay, and then we allocate the money across the portfolio in a way that is going to produce the most impact in those countries. We then have technical efficiency in the way in which that money is spent. So we have over 96% of expenditure of those allocations in those countries, which means we're allocating to the right places and those countries are able to efficiently use that money. So I think that's really important. We also have a technical review panel that makes sure that the programs that we're doing are evidence-based. So we have an independent review. Are you doing the right things? And is that money being spent in an effective way? There's a performance framework, so that's why I'm able to tell you that we've saved 63 million lives since 2002, because the performance framework tracks everything that we spend, exactly what that impact is, and you can draw that directly back to the programs for HIV, TB, and malaria. So we have effectiveness and efficiency built into the performance framework in every single country that we operate in.
Right, let me stop you there because we'll have some specific questions coming forward that I want to ask other people. James, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I think this starts with Abdu, if you don't mind. We talk a lot about bilateral and multilateral aid and kind of the appropriate balance between the two. From the OECD's perspective, how do you see multilateral aid, the importance of multilateral aid and the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, thank you. So that's something that that we study in different types of analysis that we've conducted. One of them is looking at the comparative advantages that we see for multilateral aid compared to what can be achieved bilaterally by our members. And one thing that comes out of our analysis is that, if we have to summarize what is required to address global challenges today, we summarize it with, money. And in that sense, we think also the multilateral system has a lot to offer there with its multiplier effect. For example, allowing donors to pool resources together so you get other donors to also contribute to your priorities. Also, this multiplier effect because you capitalize on some multilateral organizations' capacity to leverage. And so meaning that for each pound that you invest, that the multilateral organization will be able to actually use more pounds on the ground. So money is the first comparative advantage. The second one we see is on knowledge. Obviously, there's specific expertise that multilateral organizations have developed over time. I think a good example of that is, the financial intermediary funds, or what we call vertical funds, with a very specific thematic focus, who have specialized expertise on precise topics, and also because the multilateral system allows recipient countries, to learn from each other and also exchange knowledge and information. And then besides money and knowledge, the third comparative advantage that we see is also on sparking collective action. We often talk about the convening power of multilateral organizations, the fact that they can be helpful in coordinating and monitoring their members' commitments. And so based on all this, we see that there is value for our members to invest in the multilateral development system. Another type of analysis that we conduct looks at the effectiveness of both bilateral and multilateral development cooperation. And what comes out of the conclusions of this analysis is that we see that in a lot of cases, multilaterals tend to score pretty high in terms of development effectiveness, even if we compare them with what our members do bilaterally. Whether it's in terms of predictability of their aid flows to the recipient countries, in terms of use of country systems for country ownership, and also in the fact that they help reducing fragmentation on the ground. So these are two types of analysis that we do.
Okay, and so if you just flip that then, if that's the strengths of the multilateral organisations, what should we be achieving through bilateral aid that the multilateral approach can't achieve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a trend that we see is that more and more of our members, so the members of the Development Assistance Committee, are channeling more and more of their ODA through the multilateral system. And the reasons for that we see in the data is, one, more crisis, and so crisis response being a more important part of their ODA flows. And in a lot of ways, the multilateral system we see has also some strengths in regards to, humanitarian assistance, being able to leverage their logistical and procurement capacity quickly to respond to crises. The second one is global or regional interventions. We were talking about global challenges, so addressing or supporting global public goods is a reason why we see our membership going more and more through the multilateral system. This does not mean that everything has to be done multilaterally. And in fact, we think that depending on the donor, the importance is to be able to leverage your expertise and your own strengths. And so in that sense, value for money could mean ensuring that you do bilaterally, in development interventions when you have country presence, which means that you have a good knowledge of the local context. You have specific thematic expertise also. And if we look at our members, we can pretty easily see, in terms of sectors, where lies the expertise of each member. For the United Kingdom, for example, from a quick glance at the data that we have at the OECD, we could see, for example, that social infrastructure and services is something that, the UK is pretty strong on bilaterally. And so obviously for us, that means that, the UK is probably using the multilateral system to do other things that it cannot do itself, whether it's more focusing on economic infrastructure or production sectors and the like.
Okay, thank you for that. And just a final one. You mentioned there about trends going more and more towards multilateral over bilateral. I think that's what we're seeing here as well. I think the FCDO has got us up at around 42% of the department's ODA budget now being spent through multilateral channels and 33% through bilateral spending. Does that balance feel about right to you? Is that broadly where other countries of a similar size are? So yeah, what's your perspective on that 42% figure?
Yes, so I mean, it's pretty similar to what we see in the DAC average. Obviously, as you say, there is a lot of variation across members depending on their size, for example, also on whether they are a member of the EU or not, because obviously that forces some of them to go through the multilateral system, whether they like it or not. But overall, this is what we see. For our members, in 2022, 43% of their ODA was channeled through the multilateral system. And to be a little bit more specific, because within this 43%, we distinguish two types of flows or contributions. One is what we call core contributions to multilateral organizations. So contributions that our members make to multilateral organizations and that the organizations can use as they see fit within their mandates. And the other ones are multi-buy aid flows. So these are actually bilateral aid flows officially in our statistics, except that they are earmarked by our members, which say, for example, that this multilateral agency has to use it for this specific program or project.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Abdul, just looking at multilateral and bilateral spends, roughly, what's the maths used when it comes to staffing allocation of costs?
So could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so when you're looking at how spending is divided between multilateral and bilateral, is the donor countries' staffing costs allocated? How is it allocated? Because obviously a large proportion, well, one would imagine, a large proportion of the multilateral staffing costs would be incorporated in the multilateral itself, whereas a bilateral might have more intensive donor countries' staffing costs. So,
yeah, to be honest, I don't have the answer to that question. I think it's a very relevant one where I will check, but I think we could find an answer to this question in assessments of multilateral organizations' performance that are carried out by MOPAN, which is an entity hosted by the OECD, which does so performance assessments of individual multilateral organizations, and they look at the detail at the operational framework of each institution, including their human resources. So I'm happy to look at it and send anything by
I'd really appreciate
in written.
Thank you. If that's sort of already work that's done and you could pass on, that would be very interesting. Thank you. Monica.
Hello, this is a question for Jennifer. Can I ask you, given that a donor country will be removed from the outcome of a multilateral spend, how does that align with their objectives in regard for value for money?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the situation.
If a donor country like the UK is predominantly now giving to a multilateral fund, the outcome therefore is removed slightly from their objectives because it's a multilateral spend. So how do they then track a long-term outcome and on the value for money scale to their own policy objectives?
I see. So it goes back to, Abdu just mentioned the MOPAN assessment there. So there are ways that FCDO already funds MOPAN is part of that. And those MOPAN assessments can assess the alignment of multilaterals' objectives with the UK's objectives. That's one thing that can be done. It was something that was done in 2016. With the whenever the last multilateral aid review was done. So it's possible at that stage, so like prior to programming, you can see that there's alignment between the multilateral's objectives and the UK's policy objectives. But it is weaker. That's what is one of the sort of, I guess, disadvantages of multilateral versus bilateral. The multi-bi that Abdu talked about there is a bit more close. So you can have a multi-bi, which is multilateral organisation, UNICEF, implementing an education programme in Nigeria that's funded by FCDO. And there is more opportunity to set that programme up to deliver objectives of FCDO, such as improving access to education for girls in northern Nigeria.
Brilliant, thank you. And then could you talk to me about the value for money benefits of flexible funds, such as the Integrated Security Fund?
I can do. I know a bit less about those, a bit more about sort of rapid response within health. So I work more in health, but of course these are funds that are more flexible, and so therefore time responsive to respond to crisis. So that's one of the advantages of them.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jennifer, can I just jump in and ask, you mentioned there the multi-buys. What do you think the perception is of that approach, where money gets tied up within an organisation for a particular country? Is that generally perceived to be a good thing, or are there disadvantages to that for those larger organisations which have got their own agendas? How firm do you think the FCDO should be when it comes to using things like multi-buy approaches?
I mean, I can talk from the perspective of implementing the value for money framework in those contexts, but I think first of all it's important to say that it's a good thing that there are these different options, these delivery channels, and that should be considered at the programme design stage. And it should be dependent on the country context, the delivery risks in that country. And so all of those decisions are taken in the programme design stage, the business case stage. And so if it's seen as advantageous because, for example, the implementing partners in Sierra Leone available are the multilaterals, then they're the best versus contracting private contractors as management agents, then that decision's taken at the design stage. When it gets down to that decision of a multi-buy arrangement and implementing, say, FCDO's VFM framework, I can share a few experiences of how that has played out in practice. But essentially, there are reporting requirements between multilaterals and the UK that set on MOUs, and to change any kind of reporting practices on outcomes, funding, specifically, we want to get a unit cost for this, training cost in this place. That's difficult because the financial systems in multilaterals are not set up to serve the needs of the funder in that way, and there will be pushback for sure. So anyway, I'm happy to ask any further questions.
Alice.
Thanks. Maybe just going back to you, Abdu, I just wanted to pick up on the kind of multi-buy. And first, before I get to my question, in terms of the percentage that we just discussed in terms of, 42% going to multilateral channels and 33% through bilateral spending for the FCDO, within the multilateral spend, is there a normal split that goes to multi-buy versus multilateral?
By normal, you mean
well, like an average? You gave us an average for your members for those two general buckets, but is there also an average in terms of the split of multilateral aid?
Yes, we do have the DAC average, which stands at 21% in 2022, and maybe something important to note is that this share has been increasing over the last 2 decades. So when I was saying that more and more ODA is channeled through the multilateral system, that's true in volume and in share. But what we see is that this does not mean that the share of core contributions increases. Rather, it's this multi-buy aid that increases a lot. Again, crisis response is probably one of the responsibles, with the refugee crisis, the different crises that we've seen, as it's often seen the multi-buy aid as an easy way to set up new funds, for specific purposes, COVID, Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. At the OECD, there's an ongoing debate at the DAC on the use of multi-buy. In the past, I'm talking 10 years ago or something, there was a lot of criticism of the use of multi-buy because it was seen as a bilateralization of multilateral aid, meaning that donors imposed, their priorities to multilateral organizations. Today, we're more nuanced, and we tend to encourage the use of flexible funds, so multi-donor funds rather than single donor funds, pooled funds that allow different UN agencies, to draw from the same pool of funds for thematics, and the like. But again, so 21% is nowadays the multi-buy in 2022.
Just building from that, I think in your 2022 report, the OECD said that, to be most effective, multilateral aid needs to be aligned in terms of a development portfolio of funding. Can you just explain why it's important that the bilateral and multilateral portfolio are similar?
Yeah, so we're not pushing for them to be similar. We're trying to push them to be complementary. And, this is a bit difficult to define what we mean by complementary. But what we mean is basically that we think there ought to be a logical division of labor between what is done bilaterally and multilaterally, at least at the level of our members, of each DAC member. So, for example, the UK, we really encourage our members to have a reflection about, what is it where they have, the country presence, the expertise, existing channels with their, development partners, where they think they can implement these the most efficiently bilaterally, versus where they think that it could be done at the multilateral level. For example, if you're not already present in a country, rather than creating a new development channel, we encourage them to go through the existing one. So, for example, if there's already a multilateral doing this type of work in this country, we would rather them using it so that there's no more fragmentation and transaction costs for the developing country.
Okay, and then just briefly, so just because you mentioned the UK, so in terms of the analysis you've done of the UK's portfolio, do you think in terms of that complementarity, it's got the balance right? Is it working effectively?
Yes, again, what we did is we're looking more at the DAC level, and then we try to outline a little bit the different strategies that we saw at the level of our members. For the UK, what we saw is that multi-buy aid, so the UK's multi-buy aid seems to target the very similar geographies, so same recipient countries as the direct bilateral aid. So meaning that it uses aid channels through the multilateral system to support countries where it already has a bilateral presence. That's very similar to other DAC members, for example, many Nordic countries, Australia, Netherlands, But on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like Spain or Japan, which tend to use multi-buy aid to intervene in countries where they don't have a country presence at all. So it's all a matter of then, reflecting internally within the country. And so that's why we try also to encourage our members to articulate this complementarity within a strategy, whether it's a white paper or a multilateral development aid strategy, where they can explain, what they think they should do bilaterally and where they think the multilateral system is best placed to intervene, also to avoid duplication and inefficiencies.
Thank you.
David Mundell.
Thank you. Dianne, can we come to you? How does the Global Fund ensure that it's delivering good value for money for its donors?
Thank you. As I mentioned, we have a whole process in which we approach our value for money allocations and so on. But I think the biggest piece that we provide is really impact at scale. And what we mean by that is, in relation to the conversation you're already having, what is the most effective way that we can pool donor dollars to have impact collectively across countries and where it's needed most? So sometimes in the most poorest countries in the world who have very heavy disease burdens and potentially low capacity to achieve things. But also where we think that we can make the best use of the funding to have impactful interventions. So what we do is, as we said, allocate that money efficiently, but then also we're able to pool that money for pooled procurement. So one of the most efficient things we do is help countries to procure at scale medicines and products for HIV, TB, and malaria that they would otherwise not be able to get at that price or have as efficiently delivered to the country because they don't have the kind of market-shaping ability that we do. Just to give you an example of that, over the 20 years that we've been buying antiretrovirals for HIV, the price has gone from $10,000 a year to $45 a year. So you can see the efficiency of that not only in the price, but in the scale that you can achieve if you're able to use the money for such greater volumes to deliver in country. I think the other way in which we save money for donors is particularly around reducing the burden of HIV, TB, and malaria on the health systems in country. So we deliver two things in that. Firstly, you free up space in the health system to do other things. And we've been able to quantify that. So our assessment, for example, of our HIV investments up until 2023 found that they'd freed up over 1.6 billion hospital days and averted 1.3 billion outpatient visits. So you can see how that makes capacity in the health system to do other things. We also are able to quantify the return on investment. So for every pound that is invested in the Global Fund, the economic returns have a monetized intrinsic value of 19 pounds. That's very direct, and if we calculate what the productivity gains are, it's 6 pounds of productivity gains in real terms. So these are important ways in which we're efficient. You talked earlier about operating expenses and other things. The Global Fund operates at a rate of 6.2%. I think if we check with our colleagues at OECD DAC, you'll find that is incredibly low for the multilateral system. I think the other way in which we're super efficient in relation to the conversation you've just been having is the ways in which we can also shift funding in our portfolio to respond to crises or other things. So if money isn't being spent in a particular portfolio because things have slowed down or the country itself is not managing to move the money, we can reallocate through a process we call portfolio optimization. We can reallocate that to areas of the portfolio that do need more investment, whether that's in response to a climate crisis or a displacement of civilians and so on. So we're constantly reassessing where our money is working. We're subject to all of the reviews, and you asked particularly about how do you measure value for money in a multilateral system. We actually report on that to FCDO. So in the latest annual review that FCDO did, they gave us excellent, we always get A grades, we're very proud to say, but we got an A grade also on the value for money indicators. And so those are indicators that are part of our portfolio, part of our performance framework, and we are able to report on those directly to donors. And one of the ways that's efficient for the countries we work for is that we agree on those indicators, and then the countries know what's expected for them. They are the ones who implement it. So although we're a multilateral organization, our model makes sure that everything is locally owned and locally implemented. So that's another way in which we're able to evaluate what's happening, report back to the donors in ways that they can track to their own political objectives or development objectives, because we have a wide portfolio, so you can look at the countries that are of interest to you and you'll get the data for that country and you can track that and the value that you're getting out of that. But at the same time, there is that overall portfolio efficiency. And we are constantly reviewed by MOPAN. 2022 was the last time that we had a MOPAN review, and it gave us a very positive review, and in particular complimented the Global Fund on the way, although we are in some ways originally designed as a vertical fund to do HIV, TB, and malaria within health. We were complimented by MOPAN for the way in which we have integrated our services into the health system. We respond to what countries want to do with that money. There's a lot of flexibility in that, but we're still able to show how we deliver on that. I can say more about sustainability, but I'll stop for now.
I'll hand over to David.
So is that your pitch going into the replenishment, or in terms of the value that you offer? Or is it more wider than that, would you say? Because I mean, actually, Abdu brought up the issue of expertise as being part of a package of, in terms of, we've heard that the government is, has scarce resources and has to make a decision in relation to the replenishment of the global fund, the things that will have to be taken into account in that regard.
Absolutely. I think the pitch that we'll be making, and we'll be launching our investment case next week, is very much designed to say what is the impact we can have with the money that we hope donors will give us over the next 3 years. And the impact we have had to date is measured in lives saved, but it's also measured, as I've been explaining, in the reduction of the burden of disease. So our pitch is very much that this is the most impactful way you can invest health funding, because it helps countries reduce the burden of those infectious diseases, but it also, and we're investing upwards of $6 billion in our current grant cycle, it strengthens health and community systems. And I'm sure we all recall how in a pandemic, your community systems and the trust that your communities have in your health system is vitally important. So that's part of the pitch. But the other point that we need to make is, what does this bring to the economies of these countries? What is the knock-on effect of investing in health? And this new investment case has a huge amount of economic data in it, in terms of the return on investment you get from that. But also, we've quantified the increases in life expectancy that we can track and that we will continue to improve upon. I'll just give you one example. In Zambia, in the 20 years since the Global Fund has been investing health funding in Zambia, we've increased life expectancy from 42 years to 58.4 years. That is over 15 years of increased life expectancy, 2/3 of which is directly attributable to the reduction in the burden of HIV, TB, and malaria. You can imagine what that does to the structure of a society. You have grandparents where you didn't have grandparents. You have people investing in longer education because they live longer and they can work for longer and they're more economically productive. So that's our pitch, is that this is a vital way of improving economic experience of countries. And also that it's one of the most efficient ways of getting your money to those programs.
James wanted to come in, Sam wanted to come in, Monica wanted to come in, and then I'll come back to David if there's any more. Could I really insist on short answers?
Yes.
David?
Can I just ask from the UK's perspective, those are incredible things. How is the role of the UK seen by those that are benefiting from the investment that is obviously being made by UK taxpayers? Is there anything to show and to see, or is this just programmes that are being delivered through the Global Fund?
So because the Global Fund's programs are very much locally owned, we don't go around sticking Global Fund stickers on anything. The Global Fund itself is a partnership, very much an equal partnership. So the UK sits on the board alongside 10 other seats, which are all the implementing country seats. So those countries sit across the table from the Global Fund and decide how these investments are going. So the role is very visible. The UK has also played a very influential role in our governance in terms of the ways in which decisions are made. The value for money framework itself was very much driven by the UK through the governance mechanism. It's why it's in our performance framework. So I think that's very visible. And I would make one other point. Certainly with DFID before and still now with the integration in FCDO, there is a complementarity with expertise that the UK has, and it's one of the big strengths of the UK, is the expertise in development. That expertise that sits at country level really helps from a technical assistance point of view implement the funding that the Global Fund funds, and that's visible at the country level too. So I think there's a great complementarity to the point that Abu was making around how some of the bilateral support actually leverages those big multilateral investments to be more impactful.
When we talk about soft power for the UK, which is something that people do value coming out of this type of spend, actually for the people on the ground, they wouldn't necessarily see the UK. Would that be fair to say?
They don't see a Union
British
Jack
flag.
on that.
Yeah. That's what I mean. It's very crude, but
the Global Fund is very well known by leaders in all of the countries where we invest.
Leaders, but not the average person on the ground. The
communities that work with us, we have the voice of civil society communities and health ministries on our board. So yes, it's very visible because the voice is very strong, and it's a top donor to the organisation. Everybody knows that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you made a very powerful point about the economic benefits of saving lives and prolonging life and healthy life expectancy. I wonder, firstly, with the Chair's permission, if you could share that data with us to go into this report, because I think that was very helpful. And I also wonder if you do any modelling, looking at at the macro level, on the impact of the fund on the suppression of disease, and then also the cost of doing nothing. And I'm asking this really not so much with the Global Fund in mind, but with Gavi replenishment in mind, to sort of understand what could be the potential cost to the world if we fail to invest in disease prevention.
Yes, we've quantified a lot of those figures, and I'm a little frustrated because our investment case comes out next week, but I will be sending you that because it has all of the updated figures. But some of the things I was talking about in terms of productivity gains, or some of the counterfactuals on the cost of inaction, we also have modelled a lot of those things, both in the past and in the new investment case. So I'll be able to share fresh figures with you in a week. But I think it's also important to realise, if we've got 25 million lives saved from HIV, that's 25 million people who are on antiretrovirals, then you can see how important it is to continue that. There are still 9 million people in the world who need antiretrovirals and are not on them. So those are people who are going to die unless we are able to get them into those programs to get the treatment. And then we have to prevent those new infections. So we know now what the cost is of keeping people on antiretrovirals for their whole life. We have very effective tools now to stop them getting infected in the first place. So we can quantify exactly what costs we will save if we can prevent those HIV infections. And we're hoping to roll that out as part of our next 3 years, is those new long-acting prevention tools, for example, and a number of other innovation tools. So we've quantified the opportunity of those new tools in our new investment case, and we can give you those figures. But I think we also saw very quickly during COVID how fast a pandemic can impact economic activity. And so we're also able to model out those things. So we can provide you with a lot of that additional information.
Given the efficacy that you've outlined of the Global Fund and your value for money 5-star rating that you've also outlined, which is excellent, how do you feel optimistic about the replenishment from the UK?
We think we meet all the criteria for the kinds of investments that the UK should and hopefully will continue to make. We also think that it's a great showcase for UK innovation and research and development. A lot of the new things that we're able to implement, value for money was one of the programmatic and policy issues, but there are a lot of research and development innovations that we're hoping to scale up with the help of UK science, technology, treatments, etc. So it's not just that we need the UK's money, which of course we do need, but we need your expertise, we need the science, and we need the development expertise as well. It has been a big driver of success over the last 20 years, and we hope that that will continue.
David.
Yes, we'll just come to the point that you were volunteering previously on sustainability, which is one of the criteria you set out, but which the FCDO don't currently set out in their objectives.
Yes, and we see sustainability as one of the key elements of value for money, of course, because as we drive down the burden of disease, as we've said, we create a more sustainable health system, so that's obviously logical. But there are more elements within that sustainability that we're driving that we think are important. One of them is what I just mentioned in terms of rapidly introducing new technologies. So if there are cheaper ways to do things, if there are more effective bed nets, if there is a prevention technology that will stop people from getting infected with HIV in the first place, we think that part of sustainability is quickly getting those tools to scale so that you can reduce the burden of disease and it'll cost less in the long run. We're also catalyzing domestic financing, so encouraging countries to give more of their domestic financing towards those programs and supporting national sustainability and transition plans so that people don't need to rely on development assistance in the long term. So these are important elements of what we do. We also think that our model of involving communities and civil society is one of the key elements of sustainability that is really an important part of our model that not all multilaterals are able to mobilize in the same way that we do. So we think that's a really important piece of the sustainability as well.
Given the amazing results that you've had, and I'm thinking now about the massive threats that exist from USAID and all of that, is there perhaps a way in which your results can be portrayed in a kind of more easy to understand version, so that it can be sold better, perhaps? Because I think it's a vital threat at the moment. I wonder if there's been any. You were thinking obviously rapidly at the moment about what on earth you do, but perhaps that might be something worth thinking about.
Yes, I think we are thinking through what are the arguments for development assistance investments at all, right? There's obviously a humanitarian and an ethical argument around if medicines are available in the wealthiest countries in the world, shouldn't they be available in the poorest countries in the world? Why should you die of preventable diseases in other parts of the world? Those are moral arguments that we still think are important to make. The economic arguments are particularly important. So there's a return on investment, as I've described, for the countries themselves, which makes them better markets and makes the world a more stable place. I'm South African, and so we were very aware 20 years ago that the very stability of the society was threatened by the rapidity of the HIV crisis in the country. You could say the same for many of the countries that have massive malaria burdens right now, where their children are just, dying in unacceptable numbers, and they don't even get to their 5th birthday. All of these things are the things that drive instability and challenge in countries and then in the world. So there's a national security issue around ensuring that other countries are safe, secure, and economically productive. So we're thinking of all of the ways in which to make those arguments. I think one of the powerful arguments I was just making around science, technology, innovation, these are really important. You also need to be able to scale up these innovations in the places where they count the most. So in the UK, in the US, in much of Europe, there's a lot of research, development, innovations of new tools that are massively important for the world. Why would you not want to use them in the countries where really they would make a massive difference to their economic and political and security stability?
Thank you.
So that would be the argument.
And of course, Global Fund is life-saving. We really appreciate all the work that you do. Thank you. David Reed.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dianne, Jennifer, and Abdi for being with us today. So to flip it onto the other side and looking at the role of the UK within multilateral organisations, I'll go to Jennifer, if possible. From your perspective, what mechanisms do the FCDO have to ensure that value for money is being achieved through its contributions to multilateral organisations? And if you can, bring it to life with a few case studies, that'd be fantastic.
So as we heard from the Global Fund, the multilaterals, where there's that multi-buy spend, are subject to the programme management processes, standard operating procedures. So things like annual reviews, those very thorough annual assessments of performance against agreed targets in the results framework. So they're subject to that scrutiny. I can give an example. When I was working in Nigeria, the girls' education program there was receiving large, like over 100 million, and was not performing against these targets. It was built on a performance plan, and that was done in partnership with UNICEF there. But DFID, as it was then, had that mechanism in place to scrutinise the spend as they would in a bilateral spend or through a contractor. So there are those mechanisms in place.
Fantastic. And from the other side, have you seen when those mechanisms haven't been strong enough and they haven't worked well?
I think this goes back to the relationship. Where I've seen it being more tricky is when it's not clear that the UK has a particular a position to put additional requirements on that multilateral to comply to these sort of value for money reporting, because there are MOUs in place already around the reporting requirements. And so that additional reporting burden is pushed back and said that's not part of the agreement at the global level. So we can't put this extra reporting level in place. Does that affect the overall outcomes of the program? It certainly may affect the line of sight, from the funding to the results, for example. But if, as I mentioned before, if that relationship has been entered into, that channel has been selected because of an understanding of the comparative advantages of that organisation, then outcomes may be achieved, but there may not be as the transparent line of sight from the resources through to the results.
Thank you, Jennifer. And then just one to all three of you, if possible, and just short answers, please. From your perspective, does the FCDO apply enough scrutiny over how money is put into these multilateral organisations?
Yes.
Okay, that's very good. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think the UK has very high standards, and most multilaterals are in line with those. But I think things like the multilateral aid review, MOPAN, are really important.
Abdi?
Same impression. I mean, from the peer review of the United Kingdom that was done in 2020, the conclusions were more or less the same. That the UK looks and tries to allocate funding to the multilaterals depending on their performance, basing itself both on MOPAN assessments, but also on its multilateral aid reviews. And I think that's seen as an efficient way of doing things.
And we have an annual review every year. So that's one of the highest standards of all of our donors.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just build on that a bit, on your very affirmative yes, but just sort of digging into that, how much influence does the FCDO exert in terms of your approach to value for money? You talked about it being based on what used to be DFID's approach. Is that because you decided that was best practice, or do you see sort of now the FCDO playing quite a strong role in terms of setting their expectations of what your value for money should look like?
I think both those things. I mean, it is best practice, so it was helpful to us because we were looking for ways to define what value for money was. But yes, they were very insistent. And it is, as I say, part of that annual review. So it's baked also into our indicators. So the role that the UK plays on our board and on our committees meant that they had a way to actually influence and convince the other board members that this was one of the measures we needed to take into our indicating framework and our performance framework and monitoring and so on. And so, yeah, they've embedded it throughout all the processes in the organisation. That's why we can confidently say we report on it, because it's embedded it in several levels within the performance framework of the organisation.
Interesting. And have you seen that insistence change as you've shifted from, as it shifted from being DFID to FCDO, or has there been the same level of expectation and scrutiny?
No, I think there's still a very high level of scrutiny. Yeah. We haven't noticed if anything, there's more scrutiny. Yeah.
Okay. How do you then manage that when you have other donors presumably also having expectations around value for money? What if they don't align with the FCDO's expectations?
So one thing we do insist on, because we think it's the most efficient and effective way to do things, is that has to be embedded in a board conversation. So they have to convince the other board members, and that's not only donors, right? Those are the implementing partner countries, civil society, the private sector, who all sit on our board. They have to convince everybody that that's the way to go. And we insist that we report in a framework that has been agreed by the whole organisation, because ultimately the burden falls on the countries themselves too, and we can't add additional reporting lines or so on for the countries to report on. So we insist that we agree on that framework together. That's what we will measure, and then we report as needed and as often as needed, but it's within that framework that's been agreed, not bespoke.
Yeah, okay. Where else do you see good practice? Which other donors do you look at and think they're doing well in terms of their expectations around value for money? Or does FCDO lead the way?
USAID was a very impactful development organisation. The French have a within their development funding arm, they have a specifically dedicated health element called L'Initiative, and L'Initiative has a lot of reporting frameworks that, again, they help to embed those at the country level, so that's also a key part. But honestly, DFID was, and I guess FCDO now is, a leader in value for money.
Thank you. One final question, if okay, but on USAID, I can't resist asking how, what you're able to say about how the potentially going to be very drastic cuts there might affect you and ultimately the people that you're there to serve.
Well, we're very focused on implementing our program, but we're very concerned about the potential impact. So we're watching very carefully and working with partners to see what the impacts will be. We're also aware of the waivers, so we're waiting to see exactly how the waivers will play out and whether there will be challenges at the country level. We're particularly concerned because we've made so much progress against the 3 diseases, and as you know, these are infectious diseases, so they're formidable adversaries, and if you let up for a minute, malaria resurges within months. HIV, we've seen where you neglect the programs, the HIV outbreaks, there's a major outbreak in several places in the world right now. You turn away for a short amount of time and the diseases resurge. So we're very concerned about that. We do want to continue to make progress.
James,
yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, I think with what you're saying there about DFID almost being inherited into FCDO, I'm not sure that we quite have the same confidence as you that those reporting levels are as strong as they used to be. So I'll just put that on record. But you mentioned a word earlier, which was sustainability, which isn't really baked into a lot of the value for money concepts, but it has been flagged in previous audit work that it's missing. Can you just expand on what you meant when you mentioned sustainability and why you felt that's important to flag to us as a committee.
Well, we do think that that's a key way in which you also measure your value for money, right? So are you investing in ways that are going to be sustainable over the long term? Because as I just mentioned, you know, infectious disease doesn't go away entirely. You have to constantly be vigilant. And so some of the ways in which we're investing now, for example, in disease surveillance, or some of the other investments we've made in oxygen over the last few years, are designed to be long-term investments that will maintain. So I think that's a measure that we need to look at in value for money. Not just did you get value today, but will that deliver value in 2 years' time? Also, when the Global Fund has reduced and moved out of a country, is that still delivering a kind of sustainable model for the country to follow? So we are looking at that as a key element also of how effective and efficient we are.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly to build on Laura's question around USAID, I would imagine that the FCDO's approach to scrutiny over how our money is spent in multilateral organisations is similar to how USAID would do it. However, we've just seen the new Department for Government Efficiency open up in America, and they're currently heavily looking into this. What do you think the findings from this new department, DOGE, will find about spending in multilateral organisations on aid?
I don't think I'm in a position to comment on what because I don't know what the framework will be of what they will be looking for.
High level though, from the other side, so you've obviously seen it, you've seen the politics play out now, and this department is going to be looking into government efficiency and how that money is spent. So is there no sort of understanding where that might go and where the gaps might be?
No, because we haven't seen the framework of how they're going to conduct that review. I can speak confidently, for example, to the MOPAN review or the annual review that FCDO does, because we know what the components are, we know exactly what they're being measured against, we know how we're supposed to report on that, and we're ready to do that to whoever asks for a review of what we're doing and how we do it. But the first step of doing a review is to identify what it is you're measuring and how you're measuring it and what are the reporting requirements for that. And we don't know what those are in that context.
Hand over to Monica, please.
Thank you. Jennifer, this is a question for you. The FCDO hasn't performed a wide-scale review of multilateral aid since 2016. So what factors should be considered if a new review were to be commissioned?
Yeah, the factors to consider would be, I think this question about this proportion of spend, so the justification of moving more money to multilaterals rather than bilaterals, they will come at a cost of bilateral programs. So there needs to be justification. And I think that doing a multilateral aid review, the similar to what was done in 2016, was able to identify those multilaterals that were aligned with UK policy objectives, strong processes, and there's an opportunity for the UK to say where there's alignment there, and therefore select or not select. That was what happened after the last review, that some funding was pulled from multilateral organisations. So it's selecting the best multilaterals, for the UK to invest in, given the priorities. I think that's important because that acts as a justification for not spending on bilateral aid, which can also achieve great outcomes and impact.
Abdu, I see you nodding. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, no, I mean, I agree with what Jennifer said. Maybe one thing I would add is, and I'm not familiar enough with the 2016 Ed review to know if it was included or not, but since we didn't touch on this today, is I think also important, if it looks at value for money, to consider, some of the benefits that the UK gets through its multilateral development cooperation. For example, in how it helps, through the pooling to also mitigate risks, reducing the exposure to any single country. For example, we're talking financial risk if it's for lending, operational risk when it's, more on delivering humanitarian aid. And then also because soft power was mentioned before, in terms of voice and influence. Obviously, you have some influence through your wallet and your multilateral allocations, to put your money where you think that, multilateral organizations are the most performant, but also because we've seen in the previous OECD peer review that the UK is really good at engaging with multilateral partners, whether it's through secondments or also through its role at the governing board, where it's able also to have an influence on things like the reform of the multilateral architecture. And so just things to take into account also for another review.
That's brilliant, thank you. And Jennifer, coming back to you, what is the impact of rigorous value for money assessments on delivery partners and local organisations on the ground?
I think it depends, and you've seen in the written evidence that some NGOs, for example, will find this burdensome. Value for money reporting can sometimes be, in addition to the already very thorough oversight mechanisms that we've talked about here, annual reviews, etc. Value for money reporting is part of that. So yeah, it's important that it's proportionate. I think that's the main thing. But it has, at the same time, we've heard over the last 10 years, the agenda has shifted organisations to be able to answer these questions on what is the return on investment, and organisations weren't in that position 14 years ago, and so I think it's important to be proportionate. A lot of the suppliers, bilateral suppliers, had a vested interest in investing in their approaches to value for money and setting up systems to report on unit costs and things like that. And those sorts of resources maybe weren't available to all delivery partners and implementing partners, especially those that are locally based or run on much tighter budgets. So I think it's just important to be proportionate. But yeah, it does have, I think it has brought a lot of benefit overall.
Thank you.
I'm not sure who would want to take this one, but I think the FCDO has also started to use different types of financial products as well. So use of financial guarantees, for example. I think it's also using more the British investment partnerships. What are your views on those other avenues for delivering support into different parts of the world, as opposed to direct grants? Dianne, do you want?
I can maybe just say, firstly, we only receive grant funding for now, but one of the other mechanisms that we've found is very effective is our debt to health process. So we have a debt conversion process where we work with debtor countries and debtee countries to convert debt into health spend that the Global Fund monitors. So that's become a very effective way of freeing up some of the debt burden in some of the countries, as well as turning it into health impact. So it's sort of a trilateral win-win-win. But that's as far as it goes. We're not using any of these other mechanisms for the moment.
You're seeing other countries choosing to do that as opposed to going down the grant route?
Yes, the countries that, the donor countries that are doing that with us, using it as a way to augment the grant funding that they're giving us. So not replacing, but augmenting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if Jennifer or Abdi would have thoughts on that?
I mean, really quickly on my side, because financial innovation and, the increasing number of financing instruments that are used is also something that we see in the multilateral system, obviously, with the ongoing reform of the MDBs and other financial institutions. We think, it's going in the right direction in the sense that it probably, gives a variety of instruments that can serve different purposes. It also allows to increase, the mobilization of private finance and leverage more from the balance sheets. At the same time, we have a word of caution because we feel that there's always a trade-off, between volume and concessionality. And at some point, value for money should also mean that you consider, whether giving more, but to middle-income countries, is more useful than, maybe having a smaller pot of money to allocate, but to a lower income ones. So that's something that we're carefully monitoring also to see what are the implications of these newer financial instruments.
Finally, Jennifer, anything that you would add?
Nothing other than, if reviewing the value for money framework for ODA, that this trend should be acknowledged, so that ODA can be used in the best way given those changes in the financing landscape.
Witnesses, committee, thank you very much. That was an excellent start to our inquiry on FCDO and value for money. You've given us an awful lot to think about. We really, really appreciate that. And please, if you have any follow-on thoughts, or if there are any documents that you could help us with supplying, that would be great. Order, this session is now